All right, welcome everyone. It's 3 o'clock right now, so
We'll get
welcome.
started.
Thank you for joining us, and we're going to kick it on over to Lacey here, who's going to take over for us and run the session.
Hi, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lacey Hoffmeyer. I am the General Counsel of Broward College, and I also am the Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy. So here at the college, I'm responsible for advocating for the college at the local, state, and federal levels. This year, I took on the role of chair of the legislative committee for the Association of Florida Colleges. And in that role, I work closely with Dr. Falconetti and Dr. Williams from Polk State and St. Petersburg College, respectively, in working with our outside lobbyists and them in advancing the agenda of the Florida college system. A little bit about myself. I come from primarily a legal background. I was a partner at a firm in Miami doing commercial and civil litigation, and I found myself in a position of needing to do something with a higher calling about 3.5 years ago. And so I found the best job in the world, which is the one that I have at Broward College. So I am here to give you an update on where we are, where the colleges are in the state legislative session, but also to give you some information about what's happening at the federal level. So I'm going to start with what's going on at the federal level because it takes, it's been evolving and evolving quickly. Many of you may have heard that the infrastructure package that was part of the Biden administration agenda was signed into law on Monday. And initially, Speaker Pelosi had tried to tie the infrastructure bill with the social spending plan, which is where most of the community college priorities are found. In addition to that, the Congress has to pass a budget or a continuing resolution by December 8th, or they will have to vote to raise the debt ceiling, excuse me, in order to continue to fund the federal government. The question becomes really over the next 30 or so days, whether or not Speaker Pelosi can get enough votes for the social spending plan. It was very difficult to pass the $1.2 trillion plan that was signed into law on Monday. And so many are speculating as to whether that is going to get done by December or at all. Part of the reason that there is a time crunch to get it done is because there are midterm elections happening in November of next year. Midterm elections meaning in the middle of the presidential term. And what typically happens in those elections is that one or more of the chambers of the House of Representatives or the Senate will flip to the other party. There is, a one-person margin in the Senate for the Democratic Party, and there is a 4 to 6 seat margin in the House of Representatives. I can't remember if it's 4 or 6, but it's of the slimmest of margins. And so next year's election is going to be telling as to whether the remainder of the Biden administration's agenda can get done. So without both chambers being in step as much as they can be with a single party. So very interesting to watch what happens on the federal front over the next year. And then how each chamber maintains party control, then it's more likely that we'll see issues that have been at the forefront of the Biden agenda get passed. So all of this to say that we should all be voting in next year's election so that our voices can be heard, whatever those voices are. Before I move on, if you've got any questions, I'm certainly happy to take them. I do have the chat open, and AFC is helping me manage the chat as well. So if you have any questions on the federal front or the state front, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try to address them when I can. The second thing that, of course, is probably more of the focus of the AFC Legislative Committee and the Council of Presidents is what is happening in Tallahassee. So right now, Tallahassee is in what's considered committee weeks. Before every legislative session, there are 6 committee weeks. Legislative session by Florida Constitution happens every year, and it lasts for 60 days. And during those 60 days, the only thing that the legislature has to do is pass a budget. But on top of that, it's the only time that the legislature can pass any laws, with the exception of what's called special sessions, which is another period of time that can be called by the governor to have the legislature consider legislation to become law. But outside of those 60 days and outside of special session, the legislature can't pass law. In the committee weeks, the 6 committee weeks leading up to legislative session, we can file bills, or excuse me, members can file bills. The bills can be heard because every bill is assigned a number of committees that it has to be first be heard in before it can be ready to be voted upon in the House or the Senate. So right now there are a number of bills that affect the Florida college system, some of which I'll go through a little bit later, but most of which, what's happening right now is that members are filing bills in any area that they're interested in, on any topic that they're interested in, and then they have to engage in the process of moving their own bills along to be heard throughout all of these committees in order to be considered for a vote on the floor. What ultimately goes and is heard in any committee is determined by the committee chair and leadership of the chamber. So let's say I'm Chair Hoffmeyer and I lead higher education appropriations in the House, and I don't want to hear a bill on some policy. Well, as a chairman, I have the power to hear or to not hear that bill, but I do need to be conscious of what the leadership of the House wants. So if it's a priority of, for example, Speaker Sprouse, and he wants it heard in my committee, I'm going to play nice and I'm going to hear Speaker Sprouse's bill, of course. And this is where a lot of horse trading, of course, comes into play, is that, am I going to hear your bill? Are you going to help me out on something else? Those things happen. Those things happen all the time. There are deadlines to file these bills, and those are usually in advance of legislative session. So we're coming to a close on the period of time in which members will be able to file bills. And at that time, we're pretty much going to know what's in the mix. There is one exception, of course, and they're called committee bills. And these are bills filed by the committee chairs for each committee. So for example, these are bills that can be filed anytime that the committees are still meeting, and usually they have shorter paths to be heard on the House floor. These have probably been in the mix and in consideration for a long time, but it's a priority of sort of perhaps the chair, perhaps the speaker, in order to get that those bills heard and moving. There are a couple of bills that typically come out as committee bills. For example, the FRS contribution rate bill is usually not a member bill. It comes out of the Government Oversight Committee, and then it only has that as a stop, and then it goes to the floor for a vote. So there's a number of bills that work their way through the system in that way. So that's essentially how every policy bill would become, work its way through the system. There's also the General Appropriations Act, the one bill that they have to pass every year. And typically the process for that is that first, the legislature can, the legislature, I say legislature, it's really the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, determine how much each bucket of spending gets to have in a particular year. And those are called allocations. So allocations come out in advance of legislative session, and it's probably going to happen either in December or early January. And once those allocations are set, that's all that a particular vertical has to spend. So for example, once education gets its allocation, it then becomes the duties of the appropriations chair to determine how that pot of money is divided between K through 12, to colleges and to universities and to private universities, which all fall under the education bucket. The other thing that's going to happen in the next 30 days or so is that the governor is going to come out with his suggested budget. And what this budget really means is what are the priorities of the governor and what is he going to advocate for. So this is a piece of information that the legislature considers when it is crafting its own budget, which it would then send to the governor to sign into law, which happens before June 30th of every year. So the governor's budget is, and you may have seen, he's having press conferences, he's having meetings about, allocating money to one thing or the next as it relates to the upcoming budget year. But this is essentially a preview of his budget, which is a piece of information that, the legislature will use to ultimately craft its own budget. We haven't really seen much about the budget yet. That's typical. But I will say that what information is used to craft the budget often comes out of the Department of Economic Research. This is an arm of the Florida legislature that does economic research on behalf of the legislature. You can find them on the web. They post all sorts of interesting information that I like to monitor over time. And they post things like the Florida Tax Handbook, which tells you how all taxes are collected and where the money goes, which is fairly interesting. It's about 150 pages. They also do a long-term financial outlook, which says this is how the economy, we predict that the economy of the state will look like over the next 10 years, 5 years. And then they also produce monthly revenue reports, which it says are under or over projections. So why does that matter? It matters because if it forecasts how much money the state has at its disposal to spend in a variety of ways. And over the past several months in the new fiscal year, meaning July 1 forward, EDR has set projections of state revenue, but every month the state is collecting more than it anticipated. So this is all good news for the state of Florida. It means the economy is healthy. It means that spending is healthy. It means that the state legislature doesn't have to make cuts if it doesn't want to. And of course, this is where advocacy comes into play in asking for funds to support the Florida college system and individual institutions for a variety of things, whether it be programmatic needs or capital needs. So that is very big picture. And I'm going to take a brief break to look at the questions in the chat. And then I'm going to go over some of the specific policy legislation that has been filed thus far. So the first question was, anything in the infrastructure legislation that was passed that at the very least could fund structures on Florida college campuses? No, there's not. And in fact, in the social spending plan, there was a line item for college system infrastructure that news reports have said it's now out, that Florida college infrastructure, or excuse me, community college infrastructure has been taken out of this social spending plan bill, in addition to free community college. They had very big price tags, and but there are a variety of other pots that are going to be available to colleges, just not those two pots. If I can, I actually have a summary of this in my email. I'll try to bring it up to say to a little bit later to say what it is left on the table at this point in the social spending plan for community colleges. When you say that the community college funding is tied up in the social spending bill, does that mean we have no funding until it's passed? Well, the social spending bill is in the federal system. So this has nothing to do with the money that we get from the state of Florida. It also has nothing to do with the higher education emergency relief funds that we received in, May, January, and April of this year. So what it means is that these are additional funds that would be made available to community college if the social spending plan was passed. So it doesn't mean that we have no funding. It's that these new pots of funding will not become available unless and until Congress in both chambers passes the social spending plan. So I certainly hope that answers that question. So, one of the things that I'm responsible for as the chair of the legislative committee is helping the Council of Presidents track bills that ultimately affect the Florida college system. And once legislative session starts, we at AFC and I work together in order to produce a weekly newsletter to tell you how things are moving. What's very interesting about this particular year is that something is happening that only happens once every 10 years. And it happens in line with the US Census, which is redistricting. So once the census data is made available to states, states then use that data in order to ensure that each of the districts in the state of Florida are appropriately sized for population. So for example, if you are a House of Representatives member, then you are probably representing somewhere between 40 and 50,000 constituents. If you are a state senator, you're representing between 250 and 300,000 constituents. And it needs to be fairly equal so that no one senator is representing more constituents than any other member, and the same is true in the House. And the same is true for Congress. So what happens is that first, Florida has picked up an additional congressional seat, which, the Florida legislature has to determine where that additional district will be. Right now, only the Florida Senate has produced a first draft of maps for consideration, and it produces a congressional district in the state, in the middle of the state around the Orlando area. And that's an area that's had significant population growth in the past 10 years. Additionally, what tends to happen is that, members may find themselves living in the district of another member. And so we have, for example, in South Florida, at least, I saw a news article that said that now Ted Deutsch, or Congressman Ted Deutsch, and Congresswoman Lois Frankel are now essentially in the same district. So there's some decisions to be made there about what district each will run in the next election. You know, House representatives and Senate representatives will find themselves in the same position. And essentially, you know, we have part of what the committees have to do is balance out the populations of each of these maps and also follow, you know, state and federal law in drawing these districts. And given the experience that Florida had back in 2010, which was, you know, pretty challenging around this issue, I really do see that they're trying to do more and better and protect the process to be free of some of the political issues that existed in 2010. But the effect of all of this is twofold. Number one, every single Senate member and every single member of the House will be up for re-election next year, including the governor. So this means that senators who, you know, had only served 2 years of a 4-year term will still have to run again. So in Florida, this is a very important election next year with so many decisions to be made at the local level. But at the same time, the second effect is that it is slowing down the total process, I would say, of getting bills through committees and into a position of being ready for consideration on the floor. If years past are an example of what this will be, they will try to finish maps very early in the legislative session, and then we will see bills, you know, start to move and start to be ready for floor debate and for passage. Right now, though, of the bills that I see that affect the Florida college system, there's only 2 bills that have been heard in committee. And those 2 bills relate to public records exemptions that apply to us that would have been rescinded unless, you know, they were addressed this year in legislation, and they have been. Those went to committee on November 2nd, and so now they're ready to be heard on the floor. And that's pretty routine. You know, the other thing that's happening right now, which is unique, is that there is a special session occurring on a series of essentially 4 bills, identical bills that were filed in the House and the Senate that relate specifically to the pandemic. I'm trying to bring those up now. So let me pull this up. Here we go. Okay, so for example, House Bill 1 outlines exemption that must be offered to employees by private employers that require COVID-19 vaccines as a term of employment. These exemptions are for medical or religious reasons if the employee previously contracted COVID or if they agree to employer-sponsored testing or willing to wear PPE. So this is essentially alternatives to requiring employees to receive the vaccine. And then any employer who doesn't offer these alternatives to the vaccine are subject to fines depending on their size, $10,000 if you're under 100 employees, or $50,000 per employee if you're over 100 employees. So these are significant fines. So there's also House Bill 3B and corresponding bill, Senate Bill 4B, that create a public record exemption for any investigations of private employers by the Department of Legal Affairs. So that when the Department of Legal Affairs starts to investigate these complaints against employers, the employees' personal information don't become public records. 5B and 6B are bills that direct the Office of the Governor to think about a proposal to the federal government that would have the state withdraw from OSHA and to create its own occupational safety system. And then House Bill 7B and 8B address the powers of the state health officer to mandate vaccines. Currently, the state health officer has the authority to mandate vaccines, and this would remove the authority of the state health officer to mandate vaccines. So those are the 4 bills that are up for consideration, I think, today, and it might be over today if each of these bills are passed by the House and the Senate. And once this special session is over and the bills are signed, they will be sent to the governor, and he may sign them or he may veto them, although that's unlikely since he called the special session in the first place. So does anybody have anybody have any questions about the special session? So I'm looking back at I'm looking back at the chat, and I've got a question about what do we know about PICO funds? Well, the thing about PICO funds is that you can only watch what's happening to the PICO funds, you know, through the GAA. And there is a line item in the budget where PICO funds, which come in 2 forms, right? PICO funds either come in the form of deferred maintenance, or it comes in the form of capital project funds for individual institutions. So what I can say about PICO funds is that PICO funds this year are fairly flat from last year, and part of what affects how much money is available for PICO is 2 things. Number one, it's primarily collections, of course, on gross receipts, which is where PICO funds come from. And those are landline taxes and other sorts of taxes that flow into the PICO trust fund, but also about how much debt service is paid for from those funds, meaning past bonding. The payments on debt have to come from the PICO funds as well. So when bonding last occurred about 10 years ago, you know, the state is still paying down those bonds from the PICO trust fund. Secondly, the PICO trust funds will either be spent as cash, or the state will decide to bond off of those funds again, lowering, of course, the amount of cash available, but increasing the volume of funds available in a particular year to fund capital or other projects. Over time, over the next 5 to 7 years, as debt is retired, more cash will become available in the PICO trust fund. So, so far and over the past 10 years, the Florida legislature has not bonded off of the PICO funds. And so they're only using the cash available to fund K through 12 college and university projects. And it hasn't funded deferred maintenance in the past. It hasn't funded deferred maintenance in the past 3 years. And, you know, they have made it, the legislature has made it clear that it will fund, you know, charter schools, which it's required to do under statute, rather than passing those costs down to the individual districts. And the conversations that I've had with folks, it's because it's cheaper for everybody if the state funds it, rather than passing it down to the school districts to fund. So for example, there's about 340, 390, something around that of PICO funds available. About $200 million of those funds are going to go straight to charter schools. A lot of it's going to be used for debt service. And so there may not be PICO funds left available to do college projects or deferred maintenance. But that's not the only source of funds to do that with, right? They can just use general revenue to fund the same thing that PICO would fund. And so that is part of the ask that we have to make, that, listen, I don't care where it comes from, it just needs to come from somewhere. And, you know, you have mechanisms at your disposal to dedicate money to do these things. And we will, you know, hopefully they'll dedicate funds from GR, and they did do that. They did that last year with a number of capital projects from the colleges. So for just sheer comparison, you know, in 2020, Florida colleges got about $20 million worth of capital projects funded. Last year, it was about 110 million. And a lot of that money came from revenue replacement that was drawn down from the federal government into state coffers. So they were able to dedicate, you know, much of those funds to the colleges and the university as well. But I mean, clearly 20 million to 110 million is a really big increase, and we definitely appreciated that. So I see there's another question in the chat about CAPE. I'm assuming that means the CAPE funding list, the industry certification funds. So yeah, that's changing. Although the Credentials of Value Committee has to conclude their work by February, I think, of next year. And no, I haven't heard anything about what will come out of that list. I will say, though, that EDR had to reconstitute the labor estimating conference, and so it's called the Labor Estimating Conference. And you can look on EDR's website for the packet, like sort of the summary of the work that they did in order to funnel information into the Credentials of Value Committee that's meeting to determine, you know, the new master credentials list that will essentially dictate how funding will be coming out of those industry certification pot, which will now have a, you know, sort of a different value depending on how much value it creates to the student. So that's, I would say, of what I've seen or heard, that is definitely a critical component to the work that that committee is doing. So I would probably point you there. I don't know whether the credentials that committee if their meetings are on Sunbiz, not Sunbiz, that's the wrong one, the Florida channel. I always mess those up. And they, you can, I don't know where their meeting schedule is posted, but typically I watch meetings of folks through the Florida channel if I know that they're happening.
Thank you. Yeah, reason I asked that was I know there's changing coming. We're constantly being asked to provide any and all funding sources we think, you know, that are industry certifications in that area. I work in the workforce area, and we're being asked a lot to evaluate. So I was just more or less wondering if that's going to end up being a tier system, you know, or something like that. I haven't really heard any updates.
Well, part of the legislation that was passed last year is that for both K through 12 and the Florida college system, you know, it's not going to be $1,000 a credential or some prorated amount. There are going to be values to credentials, meaning like if you get an Excel certification and somehow that counts, but they value that like at $50 a credential, whereas some IT credential is like $2,000 per credential. Well, you know, you're probably going to, that's how you're going to get paid. And that was part of the structure of what was written into law, so that everything is valued essentially by its value as determined by this master credentials committee.
Makes sense, because we were struggling last year to figure out how to make that happen, because, you know, when you're used to depending on, you graduate 100 students getting $100,000, now you're going to have to figure out which one is worth more and how many more students do you have to graduate in order to make up that differential for your budgets. So it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, so listen, there was some talk though, I'm trying to push the effect of this out until 2023 so that you could readjust. I don't know if that's going to happen or if they're going to essentially, you know, have the new list, but fund it the same way, at least for, you know, this year. Or are they going to ultimately enact this year where we had no ability to change how we operate because essentially the year is over.
Right.
So,
And we can't really, and recruitment numbers are down anyway because of COVID, you know, and other aspects. So yeah, makes sense.
No, this was a concern, like, you know, it was a concern. And I just don't know how I don't know how it's going to shake out.
Thank you for the feedback.
Sure. So I'll just focus on a couple of things. You know, there are a number of bills that are filed this session by Senator Perry. Senator Perry has filed a series of bills related to prisoner education. As you know, there's a couple of places in Florida statutes that prohibits you know, Florida colleges and Florida universities for using its state allocated funds to provide prisoner education for state and federal inmates. And so essentially what this means is that you've got to, you can only charge them out of state fees if you're for the credit classes. So it makes very difficult. The whole process has become very difficult. And there is a movement, of course, to provide education while folks are incarcerated, both at the state and the county level. And so one of the bills, for instance, gives prisoners, you know, good credit time for taking credit courses in addition to workforce courses. And also it removes there's a bill that removes the prohibition of the use of college funds in order to provide education in prisons. And part of the reason is that you know, Congress passed essentially what was a pilot program into law, and now it's called Second Chance Pell, and now these funds can be used to supplement the tuition costs of education. And so with these funds having become available, which I think aren't available till 23, 24, you know, but you need to sort of get all these ducks in a row so at least these funds can be used, and they can be used for private education, for public education, whoever the provider is in any of these state or these state prisons or county detention centers. So I mean, that's something that I've been following for a while, because various iterations of this have been filed in the Florida legislature for a while. It's just unusual now that they've been filed by a Republican member of the Senate rather than a Democratic member of the Senate. Okay, so let me look at some of these other bills that have been filed. Listen, there's a bill that has been filed to repeal 233 by Senator Polsky and Representative Hinson. You know, it's unlikely that will move. That was a priority of you know, the House last year, and so it's unlikely that anything will happen to that. For those of you who've been filing, you know, the Student Code of Conduct statute that was passed, and also the issues around recording in the classroom, and those sorts of things. Okay, let me see. There is, you know, there's a variety of tuition waiver bills that are always filed. You know, somebody's always looking to waive tuition for somebody. It's always a thing. So there's a couple of those that have been filed this year. One of those is to cover a waiver for any remaining tuition and fees after a GI bill has been applied. Sometimes people have partial GI remaining eligibility. And so to the extent that whatever the GI bill doesn't cover, Florida colleges and Florida universities would have to waive the rest of the tuition and fees that are still a part of the balance. So there are bills that would waive out-of-state fees so that certain kinds of students will be charged in-state fees if they're currently within a recovery residence, meaning, you know, they're in rehabilitation centers for a variety of ailments. We would be required to waive out-of-state fees to those students. So there's a couple of bills that would waive tuition and fees for folks who have been in foster care, even if they've been reunified with their biological parent. So that's been filed. There's also been one filed that if you haven't been reunified with your family, but you've been placed with a biological family member, that you would get a tuition and fees waiver. And I think that's everything that's been filed on the tuition waiver front. You know, there are a number of bills that are filed around, for example, FRS. The only thing that's happened with FRS thus far is bills that would allow people who have recently retired and are police officers to come back and be employed on a part-time basis. There's even one bill for on a full-time basis almost immediately. So you can imagine in some of your public safety programs that you've got folks who, you know, have just retired, but you know, you'd hate to lose, you know, somebody as an adjunct professor for a year or a full-time person for a year, just because, I mean, for retirement, and that they can, this is bills that would allow them to come back. I haven't seen anything thus far that was filed last year that you know, are those bills that would have required all new employees to become enrolled in the investment plan rather than having the option of the pension plan. Haven't seen anything like that thus far. Haven't seen anything that would really do what was proposed last year on Bright Futures or any of the scholarships. Not seeing that thus far doesn't mean it can't come. Could be a committee bill. You never know how it might come. You know, there's a couple of bills that have kind of created some really news headlines. I'm not sure how much it's going to be a priority of the speaker or of the president of the Senate, but essentially it's the bills that have already been passed in places like Iowa and others, which essentially prohibits training of employees and teaching of curriculum around anything sort of that has now been termed critical race theory. There has been, it's House Bill 57 filed by Representative Fine in the House, and Senate Bill 242 filed by Senator Gruters. I'm going to try to put my summary of this bill in the chat, which really comes basically from the oh man, is this going to work? Let me see if I can get this to work. Hopefully this is the whole thing. so that you guys kind of have an understanding. It's really kind of hard to explain, and they're doing, they're really, the drafters are trying to be, no, it's not going to come. The drafters are trying to be really careful as to not cross the line in terms of First Amendment rights of faculty, but it comes pretty close. I'm sure if it was ever passed, and it may even be the subject of litigation in Iowa, I'm not sure. So that, really, that's the only thing in the higher education space that's really made headlines over the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. But that, like all the other higher education bills, are still, they haven't moved. Like nothing has moved, and it probably won't until all of this redistricting and special session is finished. And not having moved bills yet through committees during committee weeks means that the time frame to get things ready and passed during legislative session is pretty compressed. So it makes it harder to get bills through the process in order to be ready for the vote. I see in the chat that there's a question about the concealed weapons bill. That bill is going nowhere. Listen, it's on my list to follow, but it's been filed by Representative Sabatini, who is sort of out of favor at the moment. He, because of tweets, you should look them up. They're very, interesting, I guess is the most platonic way to say it. And, when it makes it very difficult to pass any legislation when you take those kinds of positions in tone, particularly with House leadership, which is the House you are in. He's also running for Congress, which means that after this legislative session, I think that he's required to resign in order to run for another office. And so, he would be on the ballot in the congressional race for next year. And therefore, if he wins or if he loses, he's not going to be able to file this bill again.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like he's trying to just set himself up for something else at this stage in the game.
Listen, he has a following. He does. And so he's hoping to use that following to become a member of Congress. We'll see. So that's all I have. Legislative session at the state starts on January 11th, lasts until March 11th. We'll be producing a weekly newsletter, which hopefully comes out on Monday or Tuesday. And if it comes out on Tuesday, you can just take that as have been really busy. couldn't pull it together quite fast enough in order to get out at Monday. So be on the lookout for that. I'm gonna be producing some information for you all. I'm gonna do my best, and I'm always happy to check in with folks and answer any questions that you may have. Additionally, at your institutions, if you don't have a lobbyist, and that's an employee of the college, or folks are interested in, so long as it's okay with your administration, and you want to hear more about what I have to say, or just to hear this, spread the same message to other people, I'm happy to speak to other groups as well. All right, so this is a last call for questions. I am going to write this down. I will send you the summary. It's just that I can't put it in the chat. So I'll put the summary in an email to you. If you could put your email address in the chat, I'd really appreciate it. I'll copy it down now. All right. I'm getting these. Don't end the thing yet. So that's really all I have, folks. if you don't have any questions for me, I really appreciate you joining me. I hope this was informative. I'm putting my email in the chat as well. And I'm also putting my cell phone number, which is kind of, it's my work cell phone, so it's totally fine. And you can, feel free to call me or text me or whatever you need. All right, folks. Thank you very much.